The world of ancient Rome operated through a structure of power that extended far beyond the Senate, the Forum, or the battlefield. Within the imperial palace, a different hierarchy shaped political life in ways the public rarely saw. Behind walls guarded by praetorians and attended by elite slaves, the emperor maintained a household of women whose roles blurred the line between intimacy and political function. These imperial concubines were not merely companions. They were instruments of alliance, influence, and reputation. Some entered the palace as daughters of noble families seeking favor, others as war captives taken during Rome's campaigns, and a few through the quiet ambitions of households, hoping to secure a connection to imperial authority. Their lives unfolded in marble rooms where obedience was not simply encouraged but required, and where even a subtle sign of defiance risked becoming a matter of state concern. Discipline within this private world reflected Rome's broader values: control, hierarchy, and the belief that order must prevail at any cost. As we explore this hidden domain, we uncover the reality of what happened when an imperial concubine stepped beyond the boundaries set for her, and why the empire considered her obedience essential to its stability. Life inside the imperial palace of ancient Rome functioned through a structure designed to maintain control, hierarchy, and the visible authority of the emperor. When a concubine entered this environment, she stepped into a world where her daily existence was shaped by the rhythms of protocol rather than personal intention. The palace, constructed with marble halls, guarded entryways, and carefully supervised chambers, served both as a symbol of imperial power and as a mechanism of discipline. Every corner of its design reflected Rome's belief that order must be visible and that those closest to the emperor were to be observed as closely as Rome's political rivals. The women chosen to become imperial concubines came from varied backgrounds. Some arrived from noble Roman families who saw the imperial household as a path toward influence. Others were taken from conquered territories, their beauty or foreign origins used to reinforce Rome's image as a power that commanded the bodies and loyalties of distant lands. There were also freedwomen whose intelligence or grace attracted the attention of palace officials, though such cases remained rare. Regardless of their origins, once these women crossed the palace threshold, they entered a world where their identity transformed into a role determined by protocol and expectation. Training began immediately. Senior attendants, often freedwomen who had served the imperial household for many years, guided the new concubines through lessons in behavior, posture, and speech. They taught them how to respond to summonses, how to navigate the palace corridors without drawing unnecessary attention, and how to present themselves with a calm dignity expected of women associated with the emperor. These instructions formed the foundation of daily life. A misplaced gesture, a too bold expression, or an unguarded reaction during a ceremony could be interpreted as a lack of discipline. The quarters assigned to concubines were positioned deep within the palace complex, not far from the empress's apartments and the administrative rooms, occupied by senior attendants. Despite their decorative elements, frescoes depicting mythological scenes, polished floors, and carefully managed gardens, the atmosphere there was filled with an undercurrent of caution. Concubines lived in proximity to one another, creating a social environment where alliances were fragile and rivalries common. A concubine who gained frequent access to the emperor became a subject of quiet observation from others, not because of personal jealousy, but because her influence might alter the balance of power within the palace. The imperial household was a political institution as much as it was a private one. The emperor's preferences were discussed openly among senators, military leaders, and aristocratic families. A concubine's presence could affect ongoing negotiations or redirect the ambitions of elite households. This reality shaped how concubines interacted with one another and with palace staff. Words were chosen carefully. Movements were deliberate. Even friendships formed within these walls were restrained by the knowledge that trust could quickly become a liability if political circumstances shifted. Surveillance formed an essential part of palace life. The emperor's personal guards monitored entrances and recorded unusual activity, but it was the network of palace slaves and freedwomen who provided the most consistent flow of information. They filled the roles of handmaidens, attendants, and administrators, moving through the palace with the authority of long-established service. Their observations shaped the reports delivered to the empress's council and, when necessary, to the emperor himself. Concubines learned early that silence served as both a shield and a necessity. Daily routines reinforced the structure of obedience. Concubines attended rituals honoring the household gods, participated in banquets where their presence symbolized imperial luxury, and performed tasks designed to reflect the emperor's dignity. Their clothing, though elegant, was standardized to signify their belonging to the imperial household, rather than to any individual family. Their meals followed specific schedules. Their interactions outside the concubine quarters required approval. The palace did not allow spontaneity, for spontaneity invited interpretation, and interpretation invited threat. Yet within these limits, humanity persisted. Concubines forged quiet bonds with others who shared similar fears and aspirations. Some found solace in conversations with Greek tutors, musicians, or older attendants who understood the anxieties of palace life. Others found small moments of independence in the gardens or during late-night hours when the palace grew still. These gentle spaces did not erase the weight of expectations, but they offered a rare sense of individuality. Despite these flickers of freedom, the central truth remained clear. Obedience determined survival. An imperial concubine who adhered to her role could navigate the palace with relative safety. One who pushed against the boundaries set by the empress, the emperor, or the council risked consequences that extended beyond dismissal. The palace treated disobedience not as a personal failing, but as a threat to imperial stability. Discipline existed not simply to punish, but to reinforce the message that the emperor's household must reflect the order Rome demanded from its empire. The concubine, who understood this reality, adapted her life accordingly. She observed more than she spoke, listened more than she acted, and recognized that her position, however privileged it appeared from the outside, rested on foundations that could shift without warning. Her daily choices were shaped by an awareness that the palace walls preserved not only the empire's power, but also its capacity for swift correction. In ancient Rome, the process by which a woman became an imperial concubine unfolded through a series of deliberate evaluations that combined political calculation, social expectation, and the emperor's private preferences. This system operated quietly, mirroring the subtleties of Roman power, where public decisions and private arrangements often overlap. The selection of a concubine was not simply a matter of beauty. It reflected the interests of influential families, the concerns of the imperial household, and the larger political landscape surrounding the emperor. Families played a central role in positioning their daughters for consideration. Patrician households seeking imperial recognition often viewed this pathway as a strategic investment that could strengthen their standing within the Senate or gain favor in matters of inheritance, land disputes, or political appointments. Meanwhile, families from newly conquered territories regarded the possibility of their daughters entering the imperial household as a symbol of integration into Roman society. Even households with declining fortunes recognized that the presence of a daughter in the emperor's private circle could restore their influence. This mixture of ambition and necessity shaped the early stages of selection. Candidates were often identified during festivals, public ceremonies, or private gatherings, where palace officials or attendants observed young women for traits deemed desirable in the emperor's household. These qualities extended beyond physical beauty. Composure, restraint, intelligence, and the ability to remain observant without appearing ambitious played equally important roles. Once a woman attracted attention, discreet inquiries followed. Her family background, loyalties, and potential political impact were evaluated through networks of informants who served both the imperial household and the empress. The next phase of selection occurred inside the palace. The woman underwent assessments not codified in law, but supported by tradition. Senior freedwomen observed how she managed formal greetings, responded to unexpected questions, and interacted with attendants. Her ability to maintain dignity in an environment structured by hierarchy was considered essential. If she reacted with nervousness or appeared overwhelmed, her candidacy often ended quietly. Those who demonstrated discipline progressed to discussions involving their family and palace officials. Induction into the imperial household required symbolic transformations. When the woman entered the palace, she participated in rituals intended to signify her transition into a new identity. Baths prepared with oils and herbs served not merely for cleansing, but for inspection. Her clothing was replaced with garments bearing the mark of the imperial household. Her hair was styled according to conventions favored by the empress and her attendants. These changes established that she now belonged to a domain governed by rules distinct from those of her previous life. Instructions shaped the concubine's early days. She learned the layout of the imperial residence, memorizing which corridors led to public spaces and which were reserved for the imperial family. She studied the behaviors expected of women associated with the emperor, how to stand during ceremonies, how to move during processions, and how to respond to gestures of acknowledgement from nobles and military officials. Palace life prioritized discipline, and instruction served as the foundation for cultivating this discipline. Interactions with other concubines introduced the social complexities of the palace. Senior concubines often maintained an air of cordiality, yet their guidance sometimes carried underlying motives. Alliances formed cautiously, shaped by shared circumstances or mutual benefit, but these alliances remained fragile. The emperor's favor, shifting political alliances, and rumors emerging from the palace staff affected how concubines viewed one another. A single change in the emperor's preferences could disrupt established relationships and reshape the internal hierarchy. The political implications of a concubine's presence extended far beyond personal relationships. Senators monitored which families had daughters in the palace. Foreign ambassadors interpreted the treatment of certain concubines as indicators of Rome's attitude toward their regions. Even military commanders paid attention, understanding that imperial favor could influence decisions involving regional governance or campaign support. As a result, a concubine's role was never merely private. Her movements and associations carried meaning for the broader political world. The empress's involvement added another layer of complexity. While she might not interact directly with the concubines during their early days, her attendants observed them closely. Reports informed the empress of each woman's temperament, level of discipline, and potential for stability or disruption. A concubine who appeared confident or particularly astute drew increased scrutiny, while one who showed humility and restraint often passed through her early days without incident. By the end of her first weeks in the palace, the concubine understood the weight of her new position. The marble walls around her symbolized not luxury, but responsibility. Her daily conduct shaped how she would be perceived, how she would be treated, and how long she might remain within the imperial household. The path she had entered offered privileges, but every privilege came with expectation. Her training, her alliances, and her adherence to protocol determined her stability within a system where even minor missteps could have lasting consequences. Within the walls of the imperial palace, no woman remained invisible to the empress. Although concubines belonged to the emperor's private household, their presence carried political implications that reached deep into Rome's aristocratic networks. Families who positioned their daughters to serve the emperor hoped to elevate their standing, while rival households watched suspiciously for signs that a concubine's influence might shift imperial favor. This environment placed the empress in a delicate position. She was responsible for preserving the dignity of the imperial family, managing internal tensions, and ensuring that the emperor's private affairs did not undermine her own authority. For these reasons, every concubine was observed with a level of scrutiny that extended far beyond simple curiosity. The empress's involvement often began long before a concubine arrived at the palace. Reports from trusted matrons, senior slaves, and political allies helped her understand the background of each woman under consideration. A concubine's family loyalties, regional origins, and connections to military or senatorial groups were all evaluated for their potential impact. If a candidate came from a powerful patrician household, the empress noted how this might affect alliances. If she arrived from a province recently absorbed into the empire, the empress considered how her presence could influence Rome's interactions with that region. These assessments shaped how closely the empress would monitor the woman once she entered the household. Inside the palace, the empress rarely approached the concubines directly. Instead, she relied on a complex network of freedwomen, senior handmaidens, and palace administrators who served as her eyes and ears. These attendants updated her on the concubines' conduct, their interactions with others, and any signs of ambition that exceeded their role. Concubines quickly learned that a careless remark, a misplaced gesture, or a prolonged conversation in a corridor could be misunderstood when relayed through these intermediaries. Their daily lives unfolded within a system in which vigilance functioned as both discipline and protection. The relationship between empress and concubine was shaped by formality rather than personal rivalry. The empress represented continuity within the imperial family, and her authority safeguarded the legitimacy of succession. This meant that even the appearance of undue influence from a concubine could be interpreted as a destabilizing force. To avoid this, concubines moderated their behavior with precision. They adjusted their posture in the empress's presence, walked with deliberate modesty through public areas of the palace, and restricted their social connections to individuals deemed appropriate for their rank. These behaviors were less about deference and more about survival in a political environment where misinterpretation could lead to punishment. The imperial household included a council of influential women, usually senior matronae connected to established Roman families, who assisted the empress in monitoring the concubines. This council reviewed reports, examined potential conflicts, and advised the empress on disciplinary measures. Their meetings resembled the deliberations of the Senate, but with the focus narrowed to household governance. A concubine who violated expectations could find herself reassigned, restricted, or removed from imperial proximity altogether. These decisions rarely relied on a single incident. Instead, they emerged from patterns of behavior interpreted through political context. The palace's ceremonies further reinforced the empress's authority. During banquets, religious observances, and public gatherings, the position of each woman reflected her rank. Concubines stood or sat in designated areas, their movements orchestrated to avoid overshadowing noblewomen or members of the imperial family. Through these rituals, the empress reaffirmed the boundaries that structured palace life. She evaluated concubines' composure, their understanding of protocol, and their ability to maintain dignity under scrutiny. A misstep might not result in immediate consequences, but it could shape future judgments in subtle, lasting ways. Even outside formal ceremonies, the empress's influence extended into the concubines' private interactions. Conversations among women in the palace could quickly become entangled with political meaning. A concubine who forged friendships with influential senators' wives might appear to be aligning with particular factions. One who isolated herself too strongly risked appearing disloyal. Navigating these social realities required delicacy, and concubines often sought guidance from palace staff who understood the unspoken expectations that governed their lives. Although the empress's authority sometimes appeared restrictive, it served a stabilizing role. She ensured that concubines were treated with a degree of respect and provided with clothing, food, and accommodations befitting their place in the imperial household. In doing so, she maintained the image of Rome's power and emphasized that the household operated with order and discipline. Yet even these gestures could be interpreted through political lenses. Support from the empress signaled approval, while distance suggested vulnerability. Over time, a concubine realized that the empress's watchfulness was not rooted purely in control or suspicion. It reflected the complexity of imperial life, where personal relationships intersected constantly with matters of state. The empress functioned as guardian of that balance, ensuring that each woman within the palace understood her role. While the emperor's attention could elevate or endanger a concubine's position, it was the empress who shaped the environment that determined her daily reality. In this world, order depended on awareness, loyalty, and careful restraint, and the empress's presence defined the rhythm of life within the imperial household. The concubine quarters formed a secluded world within the imperial residence, a place where routine shaped every hour and where silence carried as much meaning as speech. Although these chambers were adorned with frescoes, polished stone floors, and carefully maintained gardens, the atmosphere inside them was defined more by discipline than luxury. The quarters served as both living space and training ground, reinforcing expectations that the women housed there would maintain composure, follow instruction, and uphold the dignity of the imperial household. Every detail from the arrangement of their rooms to the schedule of their days reflected a structure designed to ensure obedience. A new concubine entering these quarters encountered an environment unlike anything she had known. Her first days were filled with instruction delivered by senior freedwomen who oversaw the palace's female servants and attendants. They taught her how to conduct herself in the presence of imperial officials, how to interpret hand signals from attendants during ceremonies, and how to respond correctly to changes in protocol. The concubine learned the physical boundaries of her world, which corridors were accessible to her, where she was expected to stand during events, and which doorways she must never approach without permission. These lessons formed the foundation of her daily life, and served as a constant reminder that the palace functioned through control rather than freedom. The quarters housed women of varied origins and temperaments, creating a social environment shaped by caution. Many concubines approached interactions with one another carefully, aware that friendships could shift in meaning depending on political developments or the emperor's shifting interests. A newcomer observed the behavior of those who had lived in the palace for years, noting which women carried themselves with confidence, which ones faded into the background, and which avoided attention entirely. Senior concubines often occupied a position similar to tutors, though their guidance was delivered with the understanding that every gesture carried weight within this small society. Daily routines emphasized order. Concubines rose at dawn and began their routines under the supervision of attendants. Their garments, chosen by palace seamstresses, reflected their rank within the imperial household. Their hair was styled in ways that aligned with established expectations, and their accessories were controlled to prevent any appearance of attempting to elevate themselves too quickly. Morning rituals included offerings to household gods, reinforcing the cultural belief that harmony within the emperor's residence depended on proper respect for both divine and human authority. During the day, concubines practiced skills considered essential for women in the imperial household. Some received lessons in reading and writing, not for the purpose of political participation, but to cultivate refinement. Others trained in music, embroidery, or the recitation of poetry to prepare for ceremonies in which their presence supported the empire's cultural image. These lessons were conducted with measured formality. The instructors expected concentration, discipline, and a willingness to refine their abilities without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Despite the structure imposed upon them, concubines found occasional moments of respite. The gardens attached to the quarters provided a rare sense of openness, offering shade beneath olive trees and glimpses of distant hills beyond the palace walls. Walking there allowed women to speak quietly with one another or simply observe the movements of attendants without feeling the immediate pressure of instruction. Yet even in the gardens, the presence of palace staff reminded them that privacy existed only in limited form. Their lives unfolded under a watchful gaze that tolerated peace but not independence. Relationships within the quarters developed cautiously. Some women formed close bonds based on shared anxieties, similar backgrounds, or complementary personalities. Others found themselves navigating rivalries rooted in political implications rather than personal conflict. A concubine whose family held significant influence in the Senate often faced scrutiny from those whose families sought similar influence. Women from conquered territories sometimes bonded with one another, but remained aware that their presence served symbolic purposes for the empire. These dynamics shaped a social environment where caution guided every interaction. The movement of information through the quarters reflected the palace's broader structure. Attendants conveyed messages from the Empress's council, instructions from senior freedwomen, and updates concerning upcoming ceremonies. Concubines learned to interpret the subtle implications of these announcements, recognizing that a shift in routine often signaled a shift in expectation. A change in seating arrangements during a banquet could indicate rising or diminishing favor. A new assignment during a religious festival might reflect the council's assessment of a concubine's reliability. These small adjustments guided the concubine's expectations and shaped her sense of stability. Meals were conducted with formality that reinforced hierarchy. Concubines dined in groups arranged according to rank and years of service within the imperial household. The food, though refined, was served with deliberate moderation. Conversations remained measured, for attendants monitored every word and gesture. A concubine who spoke too freely or displayed frustration risked drawing attention that could complicate her position. These meals reminded the women that even moments of comfort served to reinforce the order governing their lives. As evening approached, the quarters grew quieter. Lessons ended, attendants withdrew, and the concubines retreated to their individual rooms where they reflected on the events of the day. These spaces, while providing limited privacy, still existed within a structure of discipline. Lamps burned until a designated hour, after which darkness descended as ordered by senior attendants. The concubine learned to use this time for introspection, understanding that each day offered both opportunities and dangers. Life inside the concubine quarters ultimately functioned as a continuous examination. Every gesture, word, alliance, or hesitation contributed to the palace's evolving perception of each woman. Though the walls surrounding them were adorned with beauty, they enclosed a world shaped by expectation. A concubine who adapted to this structure found a measure of stability, while one who struggled with its restrictions discovered that the palace responded swiftly and decisively. Survival depended not on charm alone, but on awareness, discipline, and an understanding of the quiet forces that shaped the imperial household. Within the imperial household, rivalries among concubines developed quietly, shaping the social and political atmosphere of their daily lives. These rivalries did not erupt through open conflicts or dramatic confrontations. Instead, they formed through subtle exchanges, shifting alliances, and the ever-present awareness that a concubine's stability depended on how she was perceived by those who controlled the palace. The women learned that influence within the emperor's private world was fragile, and any sign of ambition, envy, or weakness could alter their standing. Survival required careful navigation, an understanding of unspoken expectations, and the ability to interpret the behaviors of others with precision. The structure of the concubine quarters contributed to these tensions. Living in close proximity created an environment where differences in background, temperament, and experience became immediately visible. Some concubines arrived with established connections to powerful families, while others came from distant provinces newly integrated into the empire. These distinctions shaped initial impressions. A concubine with patrician ancestry carried the weight of her family's reputation. One from a provincial household represented Rome's broader reach and sometimes attracted curiosity or caution. The diversity within the quarters ensured that every woman felt both accompanied and exposed, aware that her story was known and evaluated by those around her. Rivalries often began with small gestures, a concubine receiving a new garment of slightly finer material, a subtle nod from a senior attendant, or an invitation to participate in a ceremony that others were excluded from. These moments, though minor on the surface, carried implications about favor and reliability. A concubine who excelled in her lessons might find herself positioned near senior figures during a public ritual, and this elevation, however slight, could shift how the other women interacted with her. Conversations grew measured. Friendships became cautious. The palace rewarded discipline, but it also magnified the consequences of success. The emperor's presence further shaped these dynamics. Although concubines rarely interacted with him directly outside designated times, the knowledge that he could influence their futures heightened the meaning of every detail. A concubine who received his attention for even a brief moment became the subject of speculation. The others assessed whether her rise would be temporary or whether it signaled a longer-term shift within the imperial household. These assessments guided behavior, prompting some women to maintain distance to avoid suspicion and others to adjust their routines in hopes of appearing more reliable in comparison. Senior concubines played a significant role in managing or intensifying rivalries. Their experience granted them authority within the quarters, and they understood how easily younger women could misinterpret the intricacies of palace life. Some use their position to guide newcomers, offering advice on how to navigate interactions with attendants or how to respond to changes in routine. Others guarded their influence more closely, using subtle remarks or carefully timed whispers to remind younger concubines of their place. These dynamics created a layered social hierarchy, where a concubine's relationships could aid her stability or contribute to her vulnerability. Attendants shaped these rivalries in ways the concubines could not always see. Freed women responsible for managing the quarters observed interactions and reported behaviors to the Empress's council. A concubine who appeared overly friendly with certain individuals might be viewed as forming alliances. One who avoided social contact could be interpreted as harboring resentment. Even moments of emotional strain, expressed privately yet observed by attendants, influenced how the concubine's loyalty and discipline were evaluated. This constant evaluation meant that rivalries were not simply personal tensions. They were political realities, shaped by palace surveillance. Rituals and shared tasks provided another layer of complexity. Concubines often worked together during religious ceremonies, preparing offerings or participating in the formal presentation of imperial symbols. These tasks required coordination, and mistakes reflected on everyone involved. When a concubine faltered, others observed whether the error resulted from nervousness, inexperience, or a deeper lack of discipline. These interpretations influenced future interactions, shaping who was trusted, who was avoided, and who silently rose or fell in the informal ranking that existed within the quarters. Meals amplified the undercurrents of competition. Concubines ate in arranged groups, creating an environment where conversation flowed carefully and observations took place naturally. The tone of a woman's voice, the ease of her posture, or the nature of her remarks could shift the atmosphere around her. Attendants noted which concubines maintained calm confidence and which ones displayed signs of insecurity. A misplaced comment, however innocent, could be repeated beyond the dining room and interpreted through political motives. Concubines learned that even moments of comfort functioned as examinations. Yet despite the tensions, rivalries did not dominate every aspect of life within the quarters. Many concubines relied on small acts of compassion to maintain stability. They shared advice, exchanged stories from their childhoods, or offered quiet support during moments of uncertainty. These bonds provided relief from the constant pressure of palace expectations. But even friendship required careful navigation. A close relationship that appeared too exclusive could attract scrutiny, while one that dissolved too quickly could create speculation. Balance, rather than closeness, defined the safest path. Over time, each concubine developed strategies for navigating these silent rivalries. Some embraced modesty, keeping their presence unobtrusive while excelling in the tasks assigned to them. Others relied on consistent discipline, allowing their reliability to speak for them. A few cultivated a calm confidence that neither threatened nor invited unnecessary attention. The palace rewarded women who managed these social dynamics with grace, for they demonstrated the composure and restraint that reflected well on the imperial household. In this environment, rivalry became part of daily life, shaping movement, conversation, and expectation. It did not erupt in loud disputes or visible hostility. Instead, it existed in careful observations, cautious smiles, and strategic distance. A concubine's position depended on her ability to interpret these signals, respond to them with subtlety, and maintain a sense of equilibrium within a world where every gesture could influence her future. The palace demanded that these women embody discipline not only through obedience, but through the quiet mastery of the social landscape that surrounded them. The emperor's presence shaped the rhythm of life within the palace more profoundly than any rule, ritual, or hierarchy. His attention, whether fleeting, deliberate, or unintended, had the power to alter the standing of any concubine. For the women housed within the imperial residence, the emperor's glance was not merely a moment of recognition. It was a shift in the internal landscape of their world, influencing how attendants behaved, how other concubines reacted, and how the Empress's council interpreted the balance of influence within the household. Even when the emperor played no active role in their daily lives, the possibility of his interest remained a defining factor, in the way they conducted themselves. Concubines were trained not to seek the emperor's attention directly. Their lessons emphasized restraint, composure, and the avoidance of behavior that could be interpreted as ambition. The imperial household valued discipline, and a concubine who appeared overly eager risked alienating both the empress and the council. Instead, concubines were taught to maintain readiness and ability to present themselves with dignity, without appearing to desire elevation. This cultivated a particular form of control, requiring them to balance the expectation of graceful presence with the caution of knowing their actions could be misread. The emperor's movements through the palace were never predictable. When he appeared in public areas accompanied by guards, advisors, or members of his household, concubines responded with posture and expression designed to convey respect. They lowered their gaze at the correct angle, maintained stillness, and acknowledged his presence without drawing attention to themselves. These gestures were part of the formal expectations surrounding their role. Even in moments of silence, the concubine's behavior served as a reflection of imperial order. A concubine who received a direct glance from the emperor often found her life altered within hours. Attendants altered their tone when speaking to her. Senior freedwomen adjusted her responsibilities, anticipating changes in her status. Other concubines observed her carefully, assessing whether this moment indicated genuine favor or simply a passing acknowledgement. The concubine herself often understood that such an incident required careful interpretation. A single glance might mean nothing, yet it could also signal the beginning of a shift that would reshape her daily routine. The emperor's attention during ceremonies carried even greater weight. Public rituals, banquets, religious observances, and official gatherings provided opportunities for the emperor to evaluate the concubine's composure and discipline. A concubine positioned within his line of sight during such events found herself under greater scrutiny afterward. The empress's council considered whether her presence introduced political consequences, while attendants monitored how she responded to this attention. If the emperor requested her presence for a specific task or ceremony, the palace interpreted it as an indication of rising importance. However, the emperor's interest did not always bring security. In some instances, increased visibility created vulnerabilities. Rival families sought to understand whether the concubine's influence might affect political decisions. Other concubines adjusted their behavior around her, either distancing themselves or engaging with greater caution. The empress evaluated whether the concubine's rise would interfere with the stability of the household. A concubine caught in this shifting network of interpretations discovered that attention brought as many challenges as advantages. The emperor himself, preoccupied with matters of governance, military campaigns, and statecraft, might not fully understand the consequences of his actions within the household. A gesture intended as kindness could spark tension among the concubines. A moment of approval could create expectations among attendants. The emperor's decisions were rarely isolated. They rippled through the palace in ways that affected everyone connected to him. The concubines learned that interpreting his behavior required more than understanding his mood. It required insight into the political and social context that shaped his days. Behind the scenes, the empress's council managed the effects of the emperor's attention with careful deliberation. If a concubine appeared to rise too quickly, the council considered whether her position threatened political alliances. They monitored the concubine's responses, the behavior of her attendants, and the reactions of other influential figures in the palace. Guidance might be given indirectly, a shift in her schedule, reassignment to new duties, or subtle reminders of protocol intended to keep her grounded. The goal was not to undermine the emperor's decisions, but to preserve stability within a complex system. For the concubine herself, the emperor's glance became a moment she carried with both awareness and caution. She understood that her behavior in the days that followed would determine how the palace interpreted the incident. Maintaining composure, adhering to protocol, and avoiding any sign of presumptuousness became essential. She continued her lessons, participated in ceremonies with measured grace, and interacted with others according to expectations. Only in private moments did she allow herself to consider the personal implications of the emperor's attention. Yet even these reflections were shaped by the knowledge that her position within the palace was not hers to define alone. Over time, Some concubines gained a deeper understanding of the emperor's patterns, the responsibilities that preoccupied him, the individuals who influenced his decisions, and the rituals that structured his day. This understanding helped them interpret his behavior with greater accuracy. They recognized when a gesture held meaning and when it was merely a formality. They learned to maintain stability regardless of whether the emperor's attention increased or diminished. In this environment, the emperor's glance served as both possibility and warning. It opened doors that might lead to influence, yet it also exposed a concubine to greater scrutiny, expectation, and risk. The palace responded not to the intentions behind the glance, but to its appearance. And within that response, the concubines found themselves navigating a world where subtle gestures shaped their futures more powerfully than any spoken decree. Their ability to remain balanced amid these shifting interpretations determined whether they rose, remained steady, or found themselves vulnerable within the intricate structure of the imperial household. The concubines of the imperial household lived under a system of rules so intricate and deeply embedded in palace tradition that they governed nearly every moment of their lives. These rules were not simply guidelines. They formed the structure through which discipline, hierarchy, and purity of the imperial image were maintained. Some rules were written, preserved by palace administrators, and enforced by attendants. Others existed only through repetition and memory, passed down by senior freedwomen who had served generations of imperial families. Together, they shaped an environment where obedience became instinct and where deviation, even accidental, carried consequences that reached far beyond the immediate moment. The first category of rules regulated movement within the palace. Concubines were permitted to enter certain corridors, gardens, and chambers, but only at specified times. The palace was large, but their world remained deliberately small. They were not allowed to approach political chambers, military rooms, or areas reserved for administrative affairs. A concubine seen near the emperor's council chamber without cause risked immediate questioning. Their paths to ceremonial spaces were rehearsed carefully, so they would never disrupt the movement of senators, generals, or visiting dignitaries. Even the order in which they walked, who led, who followed, and who remained at the rear, reflected their standing within the household. Another set of rules controlled their interactions. Concubines could speak with one another, but only in tones that conveyed calm respect. Raised voices were prohibited. Sarcasm, even when subtle, was discouraged. They were reminded daily that harmony within the quarters reflected harmony within the empire. Conversations with attendants followed a strict hierarchy. A concubine addressed senior freedwomen with the same deference she used for nobles, and even junior slaves carried authority if they were acting under palace instruction. Speaking to guards was restricted to necessary circumstances, and every word exchanged with them was recorded by a chain of informants who tracked deviations from routine. Rules extended into matters of appearance. A concubine's garments were not chosen by desire, but by designation. Fabrics, colors, and styles reflected her rank and her relationship to the emperor. Bright dyes reserved for imperial ceremonies could not be worn casually. Jewelry followed a similar structure. A concubine granted a specific ornament by the emperor wore it only under instruction. Removing it too quickly or wearing it too often risked misinterpretation by the empress's council. Hairstyles reflected discipline, and attendants inspected them each morning for signs of disorder. Even cleanliness served a political purpose, symbolizing the emperor's control over his private household. The rules governing behavior were perhaps the most demanding. Concubines were expected to maintain composure under all circumstances. Displays of anger, fear, or even joy were considered disruptions. Smiles were allowed, but only in moderation. Tears were discouraged unless part of ceremonial ritual. These expectations shaped the emotional atmosphere of the concubine quarters, creating a world where women learned to internalize their reactions and where the ability to present calmness became a form of survival. Lessons in stillness and poise formed a regular part of their training, reinforcing the idea that visible emotion was a weakness within the palace's discipline structure. Rituals represented another layer of regulation. Concubines participated in offerings to household gods, in ceremonies for imperial birthdays, and in rites associated with military victories. Their roles were assigned by the empress and her council, who considered each concubine's temperament, reliability, and political implications. These rituals demanded precision. A concubine who placed an offering too early, too late, or in the wrong direction risked embarrassment not only for herself but for the imperial household. Senior attendants corrected these errors with quiet firmness, reminding the women that their presence supported Rome's image of unity and strength. Rules also controlled the concubine's connection to the outside world. Letters were monitored, often read by palace administrators before being delivered. Gifts from family members required approval, and some were rejected outright if they appeared too lavish or politically charged. A concubine could not send messages without permission, even to her own parents. These restrictions protected the integrity of the imperial household, preventing the formation of private alliances or political exchanges that might undermine stability. Although such measures often caused personal distress, they reflected the palace's belief that emotional and political boundaries must remain firmly guarded. Perhaps the most difficult rules were those that governed hope. Concubines were reminded regularly that their presence in the palace did not guarantee advancement. The emperor's attention was unpredictable, influenced by matters of state, personal mood, and the counsel of trusted advisors. A concubine could serve for years without gaining prominence, while another might rise quickly, only to fall from favor without warning. The rules surrounding ambition were unwritten but strict. A concubine must neither display desire for influence nor appear indifferent to her duties. She was expected to embody balance, present without insisting, graceful without demanding, loyal without presumption. Despite the rigidity of these rules, concubines found ways to maintain their sense of identity. Some cultivated skills that offered them purpose, such as music, writing, or the maintenance of ceremonial fabrics. Others formed quiet bonds with attendants who had served the palace since their youth. A few found solace in observing the rhythms of the gardens or the distant sounds of Rome that drifted over the palace walls. These small acts provided moments of grounding in a life defined by structure. Yet even these moments had limits. The rules existed not only to preserve order, but to shape the concubine's understanding of her place within the empire. Through consistent reinforcement, they reminded her that she belonged to a world governed by the emperor, supervised by the empress, and influenced by the expectations of Rome's most powerful families. To survive, she learned to adapt to mirror the calmness of the attendants, to anticipate the demands of ceremonies, and to internalize the boundaries surrounding her life. In this disciplined environment, the rules became both confinement and guidance. They restricted movement, controlled expression, and shaped behavior. But they also provided stability within a system where unpredictability could be perilous. A concubine who understood the purpose behind these rules, who observed them with care and precision, found a measure of protection in her compliance. Those who resisted or misunderstood their importance discovered that even minor defiance could place them in danger. In the imperial household, obedience was not merely expected, it was woven into the very structure of survival. Within the imperial household, emotional restraint was not simply encouraged, it was required. Concubines lived in an environment where affection, longing, and personal connection carried risks far greater than isolation. The palace functioned on the belief that each woman's devotion belonged solely to the emperor, even if he rarely saw her. Any sign that her emotions leaned elsewhere threatened the hierarchy that maintained control within the imperial residence. Yet despite these expectations, human nature often resisted such boundaries. Forbidden attachments formed quietly, hidden beneath layers of ritual, vigilance, and fear. The concubine's isolation created the conditions in which these attachments could develop. Removed from their families, monitored by attendants, and bound to routines that allowed little individuality, the women often found themselves seeking connection in the small interactions permitted to them. A shared smile during morning lessons, a whispered remark exchanged at the edge of a ceremony, or a moment of sympathy during a difficult day could grow into something deeper. These connections were rarely intentional. They emerged from the concubine's shared experience of constraint, a quiet acknowledgement that despite the grandeur of their surroundings, They lived within narrow boundaries. Most attachments formed between concubines themselves. Bonds of friendship developed as women supported one another through lessons, rituals, and periods of uncertainty. A senior concubine might help a younger one adjust to the expectations of palace life, guiding her through protocols and warning her of common mistakes. Such relationships provided comfort, yet they carried risks. If two concubines grew too close, attendants sometimes interpreted their bond as potential alliance, especially if their families held influence. The Empress's council paid attention to these dynamics, aware that unity among concubines could alter the internal balance of power. Attachments involving palace staff carried even greater danger. Guards, tutors, musicians, and attendants interacted with concubines regularly, sometimes sharing brief exchanges that felt personal in ways the palace did not permit. A guard offering a respectful nod, a musician adjusting a concubine's instrument with unexpected gentleness, or a tutor praising her memory of a text, could create moments of warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold structure of the palace. These small gestures could evolve into emotional reliance without either party fully recognizing the shift. Such attachments, however, did not go unnoticed. The palace was designed to detect deviations from expectation. Guards were forbidden from engaging in private conversation with concubines. Tutors remained under supervision. Handmaidens reported unusual behavior, whether out of duty or fear of punishment. Senior freedwomen evaluated the tone of interactions and corrected even minor lapses. Rumors spread quickly through the household, carried by the subtle movements of staff trained to recognize signs of inappropriate affection. Some attachments were rooted not in romance but in memory. Concubines occasionally recalled figures from their past friends, siblings, or promised marriages that had been severed when they entered the palace. These memories shaped their reactions in unexpected ways. A concubine who had been in love before her arrival might demonstrate a hesitation toward any sign of imperial attention. Another who had grown up surrounded by supportive relatives might seek similar comfort among the attendants. The Empress's council understood that such memories could influence behavior, and they monitored concubines closely to ensure these attachments did not manifest as defiance. Religious festivals, which brought musicians, priests, and additional attendants into the palace, created moments where boundaries blurred. A concubine participating in a ritual might exchange a brief glance with a priest who guided her through the offering, or with a musician who stood nearby during a procession. While these interactions were entirely ceremonial, interpretation often depended on the observers. The palace valued predictability, and anything that resembled personal connection, even if imagined, risked becoming subject to investigation. Yet the most dangerous attachments were those involving members of the Emperor's Guard. Guards represented authority and strength, and their presence offered a form of stability the concubines rarely experienced. A guard who showed consistent courtesy or concern could unintentionally inspire affection. The palace recognized this risk and imposed strict prohibitions. A concubine caught speaking privately with a guard, even for innocent reasons, faced immediate suspicion. Investigations followed swiftly, and consequences could extend not only to the concubine, but to the guard himself. Despite these dangers, attachments continued to form. Human need for connection could not be entirely extinguished, even within the palace's controlled environment. Concubines found ways to express care indirectly through shared items, quiet gestures, or simple presence during moments of difficulty. These acts allowed them to maintain their sense of humanity while navigating a world designed to suppress personal emotion. The bonds offered comfort, but they also served as reminders of their vulnerability. Over time, the concubines learned how to manage these attachments with caution. They moderated their expressions, avoided repeated interactions with the same individuals, and ensured that their behavior during ceremonies remained strictly formal. Some attachments faded naturally as routines shifted or as the demands of palace life intensified. Others persisted quietly, sustained through memories, shared experiences, or unspoken understanding. But each concubine knew that allowing affection to deepen posed risks far beyond heartbreak. It threatened her place within the imperial household. While the rules sought to prevent such connections, the attachments revealed something the palace could not erase. Concubines were not symbols or ornaments, but individuals with emotions shaped by circumstance. Their quiet hopes and hidden affections existed alongside their duties, influencing how they viewed their roles and how they navigated the complex environment around them. Even under strict surveillance, these bonds persisted, demonstrating that the human heart adapted even in places where freedom was limited. The imperial household held obedience as a central expectation, and even the smallest deviation from protocol was treated with seriousness. The palace operated under the belief that order must be preserved through consistency, and that the slightest act of defiance, intentional or accidental, posed a threat to this fragile balance. As a result, concubines were subject to a range of punishments designed not to harm them severely, but to correct behavior, reinforce hierarchy, and remind them of their place within the imperial structure. These punishments were quiet, controlled, and often carried out without public acknowledgement. Their purpose was discipline, not spectacle, yet their impact shaped the daily lives of the women who experienced them. The first category of minor punishments involved restrictions on movement. A concubine who arrived late to a ceremony, spoke out of turn during instruction, or wandered into a restricted corridor, might find her access to certain areas temporarily revoked. She could be confined to her quarters for a period ranging from a single day to several weeks, depending on the severity of the infraction. During this time, she was not permitted to attend lessons, walk in the gardens, or participate in rituals. The confinement, though not physically harsh, carried emotional weight. It reminded the concubine that her freedom, limited though it already was, could be narrowed further at any moment. Another common punishment involved increased instruction under stricter supervision. A concubine who displayed poor posture, spoke with inappropriate tone, or struggled to follow ceremonial cues, might be assigned additional lessons. These lessons took place earlier in the morning or later at night, supervised by senior freedwomen known for their exacting standards. The concubine repeated movements, gestures, and responses until her discipline met the palace's expectations. This punishment emphasized that discipline was not simply expected, it was to be performed with precision. Some punishments focused on reducing a concubine's privileges within the household. If she had been permitted to assist in certain rituals, she might be temporarily removed from these duties. If she had access to particular garments or ornaments, these items could be withheld until she demonstrated improved behavior. A concubine who had participated in music, poetry, or other cultural activities might be asked to withdraw from these lessons for a period of time. These restrictions served as reminders that privileges were granted, not guaranteed, and that they could be revoked without explanation. Public correction, though conducted only in the presence of attendants and other concubines, formed another method of discipline. This punishment did not involve physical harm, rather it relied on formal reprimands delivered by senior freedwomen. The concubine stood before them as they outlined her missteps, explained the expectations she had failed to meet, and reminded her of her responsibilities. These reprimands carried significant social pressure. A concubine standing within the quarters could shift based on the tone of such corrections, and others watched closely to understand the consequences of similar behavior. Tasks involving physical repetition also served as minor punishment. A concubine who failed to maintain cleanliness in her quarters might be required to assist attendants in basic tasks, not as labor, but as a reminder of order and responsibility. She might sweep designated areas, maintain ceremonial items, or assist with preparations for rituals. These tasks reinforced the idea that no position within the palace exempted anyone from discipline, and that humility formed a crucial part of a concubine's role. At times, the Empress's council issued written warnings, recorded by palace scribes and stored in household archives. These warnings did not necessarily affect a concubine's daily routine, but they marked her as a woman whose behavior required observation. A concubine with multiple warnings faced increased scrutiny, reduced privileges, or reassignment to lower-ranking duties. The knowledge that her actions were recorded in official documents added a psychological burden, reinforcing the importance of discipline as part of imperial order. Isolation served as one of the more severe minor punishments. Unlike confinement to her quarters, isolation involved relocation to a separate, quiet chamber removed from the concubine quarters. She remained under guard and had minimal interaction with others. Meals were delivered by attendants, and instruction ceased entirely. This form of punishment signaled that the concubine's behavior had caused concern beyond simple correction. It served as a warning that further deviation could lead to involvement of the empress's council or even consideration of more formal disciplinary measures. For all these punishments, the palace emphasized correction rather than rivalry or resentment. The goal was not to instill fear, but to reinforce structure. Concubines understood that these punishments formed part of palace life, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. The women learned to anticipate expectations, correct themselves quickly, and avoid situations that might draw negative attention. At the same time, they developed empathy for one another. When one concubine faced punishment, others observed the effects and offered quiet support where possible, though always within the boundaries allowed by palace rules. Over time, each concubine recognized the importance of these minor punishments. They existed not simply to enforce obedience, but to preserve harmony within a system that relied heavily on stability. The palace operated smoothly only when every member of the household understood her role, maintained discipline, and respected hierarchy. Minor punishments served as reminders of these expectations, preventing small missteps from evolving into larger disruptions. In this way, consequences for seemingly small acts shaped the concubine's understanding of their environment, reinforcing the delicate balance on which their lives depended. Information traveled through the imperial palace in ways that no official document could fully capture. Although the emperor, the empress, and their councils governed with clear authority, an equally powerful system existed beneath the surface, an informal network of whispers, observations, and quiet exchanges that shaped the daily lives of the concubines. These whisper networks were not organized or coordinated. They emerged naturally from the palace's structure, its hierarchy of staff, and the constant, unspoken need for individuals to understand the environment around them. For the concubines, these networks served as both a source of protection and a source of danger, offering insight while also exposing them to misinterpretation. The palace staff formed the foundation of these networks. Freedwomen responsible for managing the concubine quarters collected and shared information as part of their duties. They observed interactions among the concubines, noted subtle changes in behavior, and communicated these details to senior attendants. Slaves who tended to the palace corridors carried messages between rooms, bringing with them stories overheard during their work. Musicians, tutors, and servants in ceremonial halls also contributed, passing along information gained from their unique vantage points. Each member of the staff played a role, not through intention, but through the natural movement of daily life. Concubines relied on these networks because official communication rarely revealed the full truth. Formal announcements told them when ceremonies would occur or when the emperor required their presence. But the unspoken expectations, the mood of the empress's council, the shifting preferences of attendants, and the subtle changes in the emperor's routine were learned only through whispers. A concubine who ignored these signals risked missteps that could alter her standing. Those who paid attention gained insight into how to navigate the palace with greater confidence. The networks also extended through the concubines themselves. Women living in close quarters developed a heightened awareness of one another's emotional states, interactions, and routines. A concubine who grew unusually quiet after an encounter with an attendant indicated that something had changed in her instructions. Another who seemed distracted during lessons might have received new responsibilities or warnings. These observations created a system of shared understanding, allowing the women to anticipate changes in their environment even before official announcements were made. Yet this shared understanding carried risks. Not all information remained accurate as it traveled from one person to the next. A simple remark might become altered through repetition. A gesture misunderstood by one woman could be passed along as evidence of favor or disapproval. Concubines learned to evaluate the credibility of the whispers they heard, distinguishing between reliable sources and exaggerated tales. Those who failed to make these distinctions sometimes reacted to rumors in ways that drew unwanted attention. The network was particularly active during times of political uncertainty. When the emperor prepared for a military campaign, whispers spread about which concubines might participate in farewell rituals or who might be assigned new roles in his absence. When tensions rose within the Senate or among noble families, the networks carried speculation about how these disputes might affect the concubine quarters. Each woman listened carefully, aware that broader political changes could shift expectations within the palace. Understanding these shifts helped them maintain composure during ceremonies and adjust their interactions with attendants. Attendants often used the whisper networks to guide concubines without delivering formal warnings. A freedwoman might caution a concubine to remain quiet during an upcoming event without explaining the specific reason. Another might suggest she avoid a particular corridor for a few days, hinting at internal discussions without revealing details. These suggestions, though informal, carried significant weight. Concubines learned that ignoring such guidance often led to consequences that could have been avoided through attentiveness. The networks also played a role in maintaining relationships within the palace. Concubines who received reliable information often gained quiet respect from others. They became figures to consult for guidance, though they rarely acknowledged this role openly. At the same time, concubines known to spread unreliable rumors found themselves isolated, their words treated with caution. Attendants, too, gained reputations based on the accuracy of their observations, shaping the concubines' trust in those who guided them. Although the whisper networks served as valuable tools, they also reminded concubines of their vulnerability. They understood that their lives were shaped by conversations they could not fully control. Attendants observed them constantly. Other concubines interpreted their behavior. Even a moment of emotional expression, witnessed by a single person, could become subject to discussion within hours. The concubines adapted by learning to maintain composure at all times, presenting themselves with the same discipline whether alone in a corridor or surrounded by attendants during ceremonies. Despite these challenges, the whisper networks allowed concubines to survive in an environment filled with uncertainty. They provided insight into the expectations of the imperial household, helped explain the motivations behind sudden changes, and offered warnings that could be acted upon quietly. Over time, the concubines developed an intuitive sense of when to listen, when to speak, and when to remain silent. They learned to balance curiosity with caution, recognizing that knowledge offered power, but that seeking it too eagerly introduced risk. In this world, whispers carried as much influence as official decrees. They revealed the unseen pressures that shaped palace life, and provided concubines with the information they needed to avoid missteps. The networks existed not because the palace encouraged them, but because the palace required them. The concubines' survival depended on understanding forces that operated beyond the reach of formal authority, and the whispers that traveled through the halls, quiet, shifting, and persistent, ensured that even in silence the palace spoke. The Empress's council formed one of the most influential bodies within the imperial household, shaping the order, discipline, and future of the concubines. Although the emperor held ultimate authority, the internal stability of his residence depended heavily on the decisions of this council. It functioned as a governing force behind the scenes, a group composed of experienced matrons and senior freedwomen who had spent their lives navigating the complexities of imperial politics. To the concubines, the council represented both protection and judgment, a presence that could elevate them, restrain them, or determine their fate through quiet deliberation. The council consisted of women chosen for their wisdom, discretion, and understanding of palace dynamics. Many were from established Roman families whose influence extended across generations. Others were freedwomen who had served the palace faithfully, rising through the ranks until their authority outweighed that of minor nobles. This combination of perspectives created a council that understood both the political pressures of Rome and the daily realities of the imperial household. Each member brought a unique understanding of human behavior, making the council a formidable presence that shaped the concubines' lives in ways both direct and subtle. Meetings took place in a chamber near the Empress's private apartments, a room furnished with carved chairs and adorned with frescoes depicting Roman virtue. While the atmosphere remained calm, The discussions held there carried weight equal to any Senate debate. Concubines were never present during these meetings, yet the effects of the council's decisions reached them swiftly. Reports from attendants, observations from palace staff, and even the tone of whispers heard in corridors contributed to the council's understanding of each concubine's behavior. Their task was not merely to enforce discipline, but to ensure that the emperor's household reflected the dignity of the empire. The council evaluated cases of concern based on patterns rather than single incidents. A concubine who repeatedly ignored instructions, displayed emotional volatility, or formed questionable alliances drew the council's attention. They reviewed her history, her training, her interactions, her relationships within the quarters, and discussed whether her behavior indicated deeper issues. In some situations, the council chose to intervene early, offering minor corrective measures designed to guide the concubine back toward proper conduct. In others, they allowed circumstances to unfold further, observing how the concubine adjusted to the palace environment. Trials conducted by the council differed significantly from public legal proceedings. They were quiet, private, and focused on resolving issues within the household rather than determining guilt in a legal sense. When a concubine's actions required formal attention, she was summoned to appear before the council in a chamber designed to emphasize order and dignity. The concubine stood before the members, accompanied by attendants who recorded the proceedings. She was asked to explain her actions, reflect on her behavior, and acknowledge the expectations placed upon her. The council's tone remained controlled, avoiding intimidation while still making clear the seriousness of the situation. In these quiet trials, the council evaluated more than the concubine's words. They observed her body language, the steadiness of her voice, and her willingness to accept guidance. A concubine who demonstrated humility and understanding often received a measured response. She might be assigned additional instruction, placed under temporary observation, or given warnings intended to help her navigate palace life more effectively. The council's goal was always to preserve harmony, while ensuring that the concubine understood the structure of authority around her. However, when a concubine displayed signs of defiance or failed to recognize the implications of her actions, the council adopted a firmer approach. Punishments decided at this level were more significant than those administered by attendants. They could include extended confinement, reassignment to less privileged duties, or removal from ceremonial participation. In rare cases, a concubine might be relocated to another residence within the imperial estates, effectively distancing her from the central palace. These decisions were communicated with precision, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The council also served as a mediator between the concubines and other figures within the palace. When tensions arose among the women, whether through rivalry, rumor, or misunderstanding, the council intervened to ensure that these issues did not escalate. They arranged private discussions, adjusted living arrangements, or restructured schedules to prevent conflict. Their involvement reinforced the idea that the palace valued order and that even personal disagreements had to be managed carefully. Just as importantly, the council acted as a stabilizing force during periods of political fluctuation. When the emperor faced pressure from the Senate, military leaders, or foreign envoys, the internal stability of the household became even more critical. The council monitored the concubines closely during these times, ensuring that none of the women were used intentionally or unintentionally as tools in political schemes. A concubine's association with a powerful family could become a point of concern, prompting the council to increase supervision or adjust her responsibilities. For the concubines, the council remained a presence always felt but rarely seen. They understood that every action, no matter how small, could reach the council's attention through the palace's intricate web of observation. This knowledge fostered a sense of caution that shaped their daily decisions. At the same time, concubines recognized that the council's role was not solely punitive. Many experienced its guidance as stabilizing an anchor in a world where expectations shifted based on political tensions and the emperor's unpredictable schedule. Over time, concubines learned to interpret the council's influence through experience. A sudden change in their routine suggested increased observation. A quiet meeting between senior attendants indicated a matter under consideration. The absence of correction, even in moments of uncertainty, suggested a level of trust. These subtle cues helped the women adjust their behavior, demonstrating the council's impact on their lives, even without direct communication. The Empress's council stood as a powerful reminder that the imperial household functioned through discipline, structure, and constant evaluation. Through its careful oversight, it preserved the order essential to the emperor's residence and ensured that each concubine understood her role within it. In this environment, the council's quiet trials became a defining feature of palace life moments, when authority revealed itself not through spectacle, but through measured judgment, shaping the concubines' futures with a blend of caution, wisdom, and unwavering control. Within the imperial household, the difference between a minor misstep and a major offense was vast. While minor deviations resulted in quiet correction, more serious violations carried consequences that could alter the course of a concubine's life or end it entirely. These major offenses were not simply breaches of etiquette or failures of discipline. They were acts perceived as threats to the emperor, the empress, or the political balance sustaining the palace. Because the imperial household functioned as both a private residence and a symbol of Roman authority, any behavior that appeared to undermine its stability invited swift and decisive response. The most severe offense a concubine could commit involved forming a romantic or intimate attachment beyond the emperor. This rule existed not only to protect the emperor's dignity, but to prevent political manipulation. A relationship between a concubine and a guard, tutor, or servant carried implications that extended far beyond personal desire. Such attachments could be interpreted as attempts to influence imperial decisions, gain access to confidential information, or destabilize the hierarchy of the household. Even if no such intent existed, the appearance of impropriety alone was considered dangerous. When discovered, these offenses often resulted in immediate removal from the quarters, isolating the concubine, while the Empress's council conducted an intensive investigation. Secret communication with individuals outside the palace represented another grave offense. Concubines whose families held political power were monitored closely, and any attempt to send messages without approval was treated with suspicion. A concubine who tried to communicate with a senator, a military commander, or even a distant relative risked accusations of conspiring against the emperor. Letters intercepted by palace administrators served as evidence, whether or not the content carried real political intent. In such cases, the council assumed that any unapproved communication could signify potential treachery. Attempting to influence the emperor's decisions, even through subtle means, was likewise considered a major offense. Concubines who offered unsolicited opinions about state matters, commented on relationships with foreign envoys, or attempted to alter his perspective on political alliances, crossed boundaries the imperial household guarded fiercely. The emperor's decisions affected millions, and the possibility that a concubine might shape those decisions created fear among senators and aristocrats. Even the appearance of political influence risked elevating a concubine beyond her permitted role, prompting intervention from the council. Theft or misuse of imperial property constituted another serious violation. The palace contained items of immense value: jewels, ceremonial garments, records, and religious artifacts. A concubine caught taking or damaging such items faced accusations not only of disobedience, but of dishonoring the emperor. Even items of lesser value, if symbolic in nature, were protected strictly. A concubine who mishandled a ceremonial object or misused clothing reserved for specific events might face consequences far harsher than those for minor errors. Acts of defiance toward the empress represented a category of offense with particularly severe consequences. While concubines rarely interacted with the empress directly, their behavior around her attendants and during ceremonies reflected their respect for her authority. A concubine who displayed disrespect, refused an instruction, or attempted to undermine the empress's position disrupted the balance of power within the palace. Because the empress served as the guardian of household order, any challenge to her authority required immediate correction to prevent wider instability. Behavior that threatened the emperor's safety, intentionally or not, was treated with the utmost seriousness. Concubines did not accompany the emperor to political chambers or military councils, but their proximity during private moments created the possibility of unintended harm. A concubine who concealed objects, moved unpredictably near the emperor, or acted in ways that raised suspicion among guards, risked being perceived as a potential threat. Even if no direct harm occurred, palace security prioritized prevention, and such incidents often resulted in rapid intervention. The consequences for major offenses varied depending on the nature of the violation and the political climate. In some cases, the council ordered permanent removal from the palace. A concubine might be sent to a distant imperial estate, a private villa, or even a religious community where she lived under supervision. Her previous privileges were revoked, and her connection to the emperor severed entirely. This form of exile served as both punishment and prevention, reducing the concubine's ability to influence political affairs. In more serious cases, the punishment involved confinement within the palace itself. The concubine was placed under guard in a secluded chamber, deprived of contact with others except for attendants responsible for her basic needs. Investigations followed, examining her interactions, communications, and behavior. The length of this confinement depended on the council's findings. Even if she were eventually released, her reputation rarely recovered, and she often lived under tighter supervision afterward. For the gravest offenses, the consequences became irreversible. While public executions were rare for members of the imperial household, discreet removal was not unheard of. A concubine who engaged in activities interpreted as treason, espionage, or conspiracy could disappear from the palace without announcement. Her fate remained known only to the council, the empress, and a handful of trusted officials. These severe actions were not taken lightly. They reflected the belief that preserving imperial stability outweighed individual lives. The atmosphere created by these potential consequences shaped the concubine's behavior long before any offense occurred. They lived with constant awareness of the boundaries surrounding their roles, understanding that even innocent actions could be interpreted in dangerous ways. This awareness did not eliminate the possibility of major offenses, but it encouraged vigilance, restraint, and reflection. Among one another, concubines spoke quietly about cases from previous reigns, stories of women whose missteps had altered their lives dramatically. These stories, though whispered, carried weight, serving as reminders of the delicate balance upon which their existence rested. In this environment, the concubines learned that their safety depended on more than obedience. It required insight into the palace's unspoken rules, awareness of political tension, and an ability to anticipate how their actions might be perceived. The threat of major offenses and the consequences attached to them shaped their lives profoundly, reminding them that within the imperial household, even the most private actions could become matters of state. The imperial palace contained many rooms that ordinary Romans would never see: libraries, archives, ceremonial halls, private gardens, but few spaces carried the same quiet weight as the Chamber of Judgment. Situated deep within the secure inner section of the residence, this chamber served as the place where concubines faced formal review for serious accusations. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged, yet every woman within the concubine quarters knew of it. The chamber represented the boundary between correction and consequence, a place where the hidden governance of the palace revealed its firmest resolve. The chamber itself was designed with intention. Its walls were decorated with frescoes portraying figures of Roman discipline and virtue, not as a reminder of glory, but as a symbolic frame for the proceedings. A raised seat at the center belonged to the presiding member of the Empress's council, flanked by chairs for other council members. A small table held wax tablets for recording decisions, while attendants stood at designated points along the walls to ensure order. The space was neither dark nor intimidating by design, but its stillness created a sense of solemnity that no concubine could ignore. A concubine summoned to this chamber did not arrive unexpectedly. She was informed by attendants in a tone that conveyed seriousness without revealing details. Her walk to the chamber followed a prescribed route. escorted by senior freedwomen, who ensured she neither spoke to others nor deviated from the path. This procession reinforced the authority of the council and emphasized that the matter had risen above ordinary oversight. Concubines who witnessed another being, led to the chamber, understood immediately that a significant decision awaited her. Once inside, the concubine stood in a designated space facing the council. There were no shackles, restraints, or harsh commands. The proceedings relied on formality and structure rather than intimidation. A senior freedwoman announced the concubine's name, her family background, her years of service within the imperial household, and the nature of the concerns prompting the council's evaluation. The council members listened in silence, their expressions controlled, maintaining the decorum expected of their position. Questions followed, delivered in calm, measured tones. The concubine was asked to recount her actions, explain moments of suspicion, or provide clarity on interactions that had drawn attention. She was expected to answer honestly, demonstrating humility and respect. The council evaluated not only her words, but her demeanor, whether she met their eyes appropriately, maintained composure, and accepted responsibility where necessary. A concubine who grew defensive or evasive risked deepening the council's concern, for such behavior suggested a lack of discipline or awareness of palace expectations. The attendants present in the chamber contributed to the proceedings through written observations. Their testimonies were recorded on wax tablets and included details ranging from the concubine's participation in ceremonies to her conduct during instruction. These documents served not as accusations, but as evidence of patterns. A concubine might find that a small incident, she had forgotten a late arrival, a whispered exchange, an improperly executed ritual, had been observed and noted by palace staff. The cumulative weight of these records shaped the council's understanding of her behavior. Sometimes, another concubine or staff member was summoned to the chamber to provide context. These testimonies were offered with restraint, for the palace discouraged open accusations among those who lived within its walls. The goal was clarity, not confrontation. Individuals called upon for testimony understood the gravity of the setting and delivered their statements with the same calmness expected of the accused. Their presence emphasized that the chamber of judgment functioned as a space for evaluation, not personal rivalry. When the council felt they had gathered sufficient information, they dismissed the concubine to wait in a private room nearby. The deliberation that followed took place behind closed doors. Council members discussed the evidence, considered the concubine's responses, and evaluated the larger context. Their goal was to determine not merely whether the concubine had acted improperly, but whether her behavior signaled potential danger to the stability of the imperial household. They considered her past conduct, her relationships, her family ties, and the likelihood that the behavior in question might recur. Once the council reached a decision, the concubine was summoned back into the chamber. The ruling was delivered with clarity and precision. If the offense was deemed minor within the larger context, the council imposed corrective measures, additional supervision, heightened instruction, or temporary confinement. If the offense indicated deeper concerns, they issued more serious consequences: reassignment to lower duties, removal from ceremonial roles, or transfer to a distant residence within the imperial estates. In the most severe cases, the ruling reflected the council's duty to protect the imperial household above all else. A concubine whose actions suggested political manipulation, betrayal, or threat-faced removal from the palace entirely. The manner of her removal was discreet, carried out with minimal disruption to the household. The council's decision was final, recorded in the palace archives but rarely discussed. Silence protected both the household and the empire's image. The effect of the Chamber of Judgment extended far beyond the cases heard within its walls. Its existence shaped the behavior of every concubine. They knew that the palace observed everything: movements, interactions, and subtle shifts in emotion. They understood that the council served as both guide and guardian, interpreting actions through the lens of imperial stability. And they recognized that even the most disciplined among them could be called to the chamber if circumstances required. Among the concubines, stories of past proceedings circulated quietly, carried through whisper networks, and preserved in shared memory. These stories reinforced the seriousness of the chamber's purpose and reminded the women of the thin line separating routine discipline from formal evaluation. The lessons drawn from such stories: humility, caution, awareness became part of their daily existence. Through its calm rituals and decisive rulings, the Chamber of Judgment embodied the authority of the Empress's council. It ensured that the imperial household remained ordered, disciplined, and prepared to confront challenges without chaos. For the concubines, it stood as both a symbol of fairness and a reminder of the consequences of missteps. In a world shaped by observation and expectation, the chamber represented the moment when silence gave way to clarity, and when the quiet rules of palace life revealed their full weight. Among the concubines, few events existed only in whispers, but the final procession of the condemned was one of them. Not because it was hidden, but because those who witnessed even the smallest trace of it spoke of it sparingly. The imperial palace never publicized such proceedings, yet the women learned early that certain actions led not to correction, not to isolation, but to an irreversible end. The procession was not a spectacle, it was a controlled transition, designed to protect the emperor's household, preserve the empire's dignity, and erase the presence of a concubine whose offense reached beyond redemption. The procession always began in silence. A concubine who had been judged guilty of a major offense, whether political betrayal, forbidden intimacy, treasonous communication, or perceived threat to imperial security, was removed from her chamber at dawn. Attendants did not raise their voices, and guards did not brandish their weapons. Instead, two senior freedwomen informed her of the council's decision with a calmness that carried far greater weight than anger. Their tone left no room for questions. She was to accompany them immediately, and her refusal, though almost never seen, would have changed nothing. Her appearance was altered before departure. She was dressed in plain linen without adornment, her hair unpinned and unbound. This simplicity served two purposes: to signal her removal from the privileges of the palace, and to prevent the procession from attracting undue attention. Even in punishment, the imperial household preserved dignity. The concubine walked barefoot, not as humiliation, but as a reminder that she no longer belonged to the ordered world she had once been part of. The route she took was deliberate. She did not pass through the main corridors where attendants prepared for morning rituals, or where other concubines began their lessons. Instead, she was led through quiet passageways rarely used except for such proceedings. These corridors were lined with faded frescoes and dim lamps, preserving spaces meant only for the palace's most solemn tasks. A concubine walking this path understood fully that she had crossed the boundary between life within the emperor's world and life beyond it, or, in some cases, the end of life itself. Guards accompanied the procession only when necessary, maintaining distance to preserve formality. Their role was not to intimidate, but to ensure order. The concubine was not shackled. She was not treated with violence. The palace believed that dignity remained essential even in punishment. Those who watched from afar, attendants cleaning corridors or scribes delivering tablets, lowered their eyes, not from disdain, but from the recognition that this moment signified a profound and irreversible shift. Where the procession ended depended on the council's ruling. Some concubines were taken to secondary imperial estates, remote villas, or inland residences far from Rome. These women lived out their remaining years under supervision, neither imprisoned nor free, existing in a quiet shadow of the life they once knew. Such outcomes occurred when the offense was serious but not dangerous to Rome itself. More severe cases led the procession to the palace's secure outer wing, where the condemned concubine was transferred to officials assigned to enforce the empire's harshest sentences. What happened beyond that point was never spoken of in the palace. Rumors circulated suggestions of exile to labor camps, quiet removal ordered by the emperor or the Senate, or final rites conducted out of public view, but none of the concubines knew the truth. The not knowing was part of the discipline. It preserved fear without spectacle, order without brutality performed before the household. One of the most haunting elements of the procession was its stillness. There were no shouts, no pleadings, no resistance. Concubines understood the palace too well. They knew that once the council had reached such a decision, reversal was impossible. Discipline shaped even their final steps. Many walked with composure, shoulders straight, eyes fixed on the floor. A few showed trembling hesitation, but attendants guided them forward gently. Tears were rare not because the women felt no fear, but because they had spent years mastering the art of silent emotion. For the concubines who remained behind, the procession became a powerful memory. They never saw its full course, only hints of movement, echoes of footsteps, a door closing in the early dawn. Yet these fragments were enough. They reminded the women that their lives balanced delicately on perception, obedience, and restraint. The palace did not need demonstrations of violence. It relied on structure, silence, and the knowledge that consequences existed even if unseen. In the days following a procession, the concubine's chamber was emptied quietly. Her garments were archived or repurposed. Her name was removed from the roster of ceremonial participants. Instructors adjusted their lessons without reference to her absence. The household absorbed the loss with efficient calm, as if the concubine had never existed. Only the other women remembered her, recalling when she had arrived, the hopes she once held, and the small moments that hinted at her inner life. Yet even these memories faded. The palace demanded forward motion, not reflection. The emperor's household, vast and intricate, could not pause for individual stories without risking instability. And so the procession, solemn and silent, ensured that life within the concubine quarters continued with its usual rituals, lessons, and expectations. Still, its shadow lingered. Each concubine carried the knowledge that discipline was not only a rule, but a condition of survival. The procession served as the clearest reminder that the imperial household existed beyond personal desire, beyond affection, beyond fear. It existed as a world governed by stability, structure, and the quiet enforcement of consequences. In this environment, the final procession of the condemned became both an ending and a lesson, an embodiment of authority within the palace, and a silent echo that shaped every decision the concubines made thereafter.